Five, four, three, two, one. Thunderbirds are go. Welcome, Yuval Yeret, our
Hi,
guest
Jim.
for today. How are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you again, Jim. I'm
Yeah, we've
good.
been. Yeah. Surprisingly, my response usually if somebody says you look good, it's like, hey, you got to get to Lens Crafters. Quality eyeglasses in about an hour. You clearly your eyes are going. So today we're talking about agility in the private equity space, which is going to be a religious war over Agile, not, but it's a good way to introduce it. So, Yuval, you got a great background. So just talk a little bit about your background, how you got into the space, and kind of your focus on project management, and we're going to dive into the details of this.
Sure. Um, yeah, so a bit about me. I've been in the product development space, started in the Israeli Air Force back in the 90s, mainframes, TCP/IP installation on mainframes, routing, networking stuff.
Hold on, I didn't know you were a ZOS guy. Interesting, you're a ZOS guy. All right, ISPF.
Yes, exactly.
All
I
right.
installed TCP/IP on the Israeli Air Force mainframe back in
Oh,
the
nice.
90s.
Yeah, that was back when you got to remember that the IBM like SNA, they didn't like TCP. Neither did DEC. I mean, DEC had DECnet. TCP/IP on a non-Unix operating system was like a big deal back in those days.
Yes, it was. I was in charge of the VPS, virtual printer system,
Oh man, this is weird.
exit
This is a good.
codes. I was pretty good at assembly,
Yeah,
coding
sure.
from
Yeah.
my original, Israeli Army computer school. So they sent me to the systems team. And from then on, my career for like 13 or so years was in the, let's call it lower in the OSI stack, lower
Sure.
working with
Yeah. Yeah.
networking, Linux kernel stuff, but eventually made my way to leading teams in those environments, engineering and product development leadership. Back in 2000, around 2005, 6, started to feel the pain of some problems in how we were working at the time and started to look at different ways to do things. Got the Agile bug. We started to use it in my engineering group in 2 places. And since 2009, I've been helping others do this. A lot of the companies that I worked with were companies that were in spaces like that, deep technology, networking, storage, but over time it became more and more diverse. Cybersecurity companies, you know, other devices, healthcare, banking, financial tech, so all over the place, including all the way to recently companies like Gillette and biotech farm, companies in the Boston area, trying to help them figure out how to do this agile thing, how to become more agile, how to figure out agility, how to navigate this weird space with so much dogma around it, and
Well,
so
that's the
many business
key.
wars around it.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
even Martin Fowler, kind of one of the original signatories, he claimed that when vendors got involved, they kind of ruined everything when it came to Agile. Because I think
to
if you read,
everything. You
yeah,
could say
it's
it
true.
about everything, right?
Right. Yeah, because we buy software companies. I can't install all of them. I'll get crucified. But it's true that I mean, the interesting part is if you read the original manifesto, a lot of the rules were arbitrary on purpose. They just had to pick something, and people sort of treated them as a real religious, endeavor. And I remember the original, Kent Beck, a lot of Kent's writing. So he was kind of the angry young man of Agile, if you will. And I think Kent's original argument, I think, was a good one, which was, hey, software developers, we have to be flexible about change. That customer requirements change. We can't be on some roadmap.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side, management, you can't tell me how long it should take to build this and what it should cost to build it because you don't know anything about engineering. This became the sort of, I think, to me, that was the stress between the two is software developers getting more flexible about, hey, looks like the customer needs change, we have to change direction, but at the same time it's like guys who aren't writing code telling me how long it should take me to write code. became a problem. Is that a fair? I mean, that was the
Yeah,
kind of the religion
I
of war
still
originally.
recall sitting on a panel in an Agile conference like 10 years back, if not more. And there's this question from the audience of, leadership is asking us to predict, to give a roadmap, to say, when is this thing that we're working on going to be done? And having one of the Agile pundits, speaking of dogma, saying, you can't say when it's going to be done. We're living in a VUCA world, right? Volatility, uncertainty. We simply don't know. And my role in that conversation and in the world in general is trying to meet people where they are, trying
Yes.
to both the engineers that are right in the fact that we cannot predict everything, but also meet leadership and management and the business and product people that sometimes do need to make some plans. How do we make those plans? How can we predict what is reasonable to predict and what is unreasonable to predict, and what levers, what degrees of freedom can we have in order to be able to predict if something is really important for us to predict? That's the pragmatic conversation around agility rather than the dogmatic, you can't predict anything.
Right. Well, I mean, that was I had a boss years and years ago who was a big fan of Disney, and I'm not anti-Disney or a big fan of Disney. Just I personally the wrong generation to be a Disney fan. When I started having younger kids, different story. Yeah, but I still remember the presentation a long time ago, and this is Yuval, this is pre-Agile, so call it early to mid, maybe even late 80s, and his premise was we should all be like Disney. When the movie hits, the toys ready for the store, the rides are ready at the theme park, the marketing's built around it. That it was the whole product release. It wasn't just, hey, we get the movie, now what should we do about the toys now? And his argument was, hey, we're not there in software, but we should think about that as a goal, right? And I think that's part of what was the good part about Agile. It's not just because we see this all the time. It's not just getting the product done. Do we have the documentation? Do we have the marketing materials? How do we sell it? What's the value proposition to customers? And a lot of that is kind of lost in the shuffle. We don't think of the whole product, solution. And that's part of, we've gotten a little, most of the teams I see today on our side, in our portfolio companies, whether they're completely honest with themselves or not, they're all doing some version of Agile. Now, the fanatics will tell you that, if it's not perfect Agile, it's not Agile. I'm pushing that. They tend to be, if it's not Agile, let's call it orthodox Agile. If it's not orthodox Agile, it's waterfall. And I don't think that's
Nobody's
true.
using waterfall these days. Let's be honest about it.
Right,
and
but
I care less about whether it's uppercase A Agile and lowercase a. I think Agile as a term, and we'll probably talk about it later, there's a lot going on with that term Agile that is unhealthy, that has become toxic even, I would say. And there's a question, what is going to replace it? Is it agility? Is it product operating model? If you ask some of the big consulting firms in this space, there's going to be another name, but I think we can agree that, I hope, most of your portfolio companies are at least trying to close fast feedback loops and learn rather than make assumptions and build for years without validating these assumptions, which is essentially what we're trying to do with Agile. Yes. And I agree with you, by the way, that part of what happened is that because of many reasons, Agile started in just development. And when people implemented Agile frameworks and Agile techniques just in development, they forgot about all of the other stuff, go-to-market stuff, product marketing, even operations wasn't part of the initial picture. And then, people had to add it through DevOps. It's not that the Agile concepts themselves don't think about these things. Agile was not framed, or there is a good conversation around whether Agile was framed initially in an inclusive and encompassing enough way to include all of these other aspects, or was it too focused on solving the developers, problems. But it's pretty clear these days that when we are talking about successfully using Agile, it does have to include all of these other aspects.
Yeah, I argue where they missed, and I don't think it was. I think it was inclusive. I think people just read it the wrong way or didn't think they had the problem elsewhere. And using the agile approach outside of engineering, is something that I think we're still in the early stages of, and we should be much farther along. I mean, marketing departments, tech support departments, you name it, sales departments. That problem of not having quick feedback loops tends to be a problem in all of those. I think the highlight was in engineering, and that's what people thought the problem was first, but it's been everywhere. And I don't think we've done a great job of extending it beyond that. I still don't think, even in engineering, even my best teams, we don't talk to customers enough. There's always still the fear of talking to customers. And, that's, I know it's hard because nobody likes feedback they don't like, but why should you assume it's not going to be good feedback? It may be really good feedback. In fact, they may be able to lead you in a much better direction, than you would do on your own.
It has to do with vulnerability, right?
Yes. Yep.
It's more vulnerable to say, I'm not sure. It's an hypothesis, right?
Yep.
As investors, do you acknowledge that your investment thesis is in many cases an hypothesis?
It's always a hypothesis. 100% of the time.
Do you plan according to the fact that it is an hypothesis? Do you run feedback loops in how you,
yeah, so I would
100-day plan, 1-year plan for achieving this investment thesis?
Yeah, so I would tell you, so that's interesting. So I would say I'm a if anything lights me up like a Christmas tree, it's the 90, 180, 12-month plan. All of our anything beyond like the next 30 to 60 days is directional. It's not a plan, right? So we look at this as it depends. So what are we going to do first? Let's I'm okay with having a line that says, hey, we want to try to get here, we think, in the next 18 to 24 months, but we may be way off, way off. And especially if you treat it like a moon landing, off by 2 degrees, we're out in space for the rest of our lives, right? It has to be, it depends. We have to do a lot of course correction. And that's one of the key things about Agile is this idea of course correction, because again, and for us, that feedback loop, with a hypothesis, we believe a little bit in the Ray Dalio approach, which is find 2 really smart people who completely disagree on an issue and get in the middle of them, and you'll learn a lot, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we have to make our own decision, but what do I know about X, Y, Z, right? The best thing to do is find really smart people and let them tell you what they think. And we find that to be a much better way of, I love having a great thing for me is a hypothesis that, returns 100 times our money. Sure. Also a great one is that gets killed right away because it's a really dumb idea. And I didn't spend 6 months, banging my head against the wall thinking this was a great hypothesis. I mean, both of those are great outcomes, and to be fair, the whole fail fast, I hate that expression. It's just dumb. It's like, oh, failing's great. Failing's not great. Failing is lousy. But if you fail without wasting a ton of time, that's not failure to me. That's course correction. Is that fair?
Yeah. I like to look at it as risk or de-risk. I'm working now with an organization whose whole purpose in the world is to help people manage risk. A company in Chicago. And I find that people don't talk enough about the relationship between Agile and risk at multiple levels. And the way I've recently started to look at this is to use the IDEO model of the different types of risks: desirability, viability, feasibility. Each one of these is a potential risk that you might have when you're building products or when you're trying to come up with a new sales management approach. Let's say you're trying to implement force management in your sales and revenue organization. There's desirability for the salespeople. Do they want to work this way? Do the sales leaders want to work this way? Do your customers want to have conversations that are the sort of conversations that force talks about? Is it feasible to do it? Probably not the biggest risk for that sort of question, because Salesforce can do force management, whatever. And is it something we can do from a business perspective? Each one of these are risks that the whole purpose of Agile is to reduce the risk that we're taking the wrong approach, either because we are focusing on the wrong problem or that we're taking the wrong direction in solving that problem, or that something else is going on. So, for me, if we can learn on something as quickly as possible and based on that make a decision which way to go, that's a success. That's not a failure. But it's acknowledging that a lot of our assumptions, our leap of faith assumptions, might be wrong.
Yeah, and I mean that's the interest. I guess the other interesting part. I'd love to hear your thought on this. That one of the places where I see this go wrong, even in organizations that are looking at it the right way, things happen in the market, and when you maybe you've de-risked yourself and you've used the right approach, but you can that risk profile can change sometimes almost overnight. Without you expecting it. Now, for me, so let's use a great example. And I don't have a specific use case here, but AI and the ChatGPT processes have disrupted a lot of software companies. And again, I hate to disrupt because that becomes another one of those. I'm a change agent who disrupts. I'm not saying that. It's there's been a quantum leap in what you're able to do around analyzing text. It's not a perfect solution, but any business that's got a heavy amount of text processing is going to have to rethink what they're doing in light of kind of the improvements in these large language models. And so that's one of the things that we see when I look at risk. I don't know if you've encountered that in the wild, but I found cases where, hey, we've done everything right and de-risked. We've got good feedback loops, but we're 3/4 of the way down the path on this product, and suddenly the market has something innovative has cut the legs off from this, and we've got to admit to the fact that we did everything right, but it doesn't matter. We're going to have to change direction. And I don't know if you find that happens a lot in real life.
COVID was another example where companies, I was working with a healthcare provider. We were talking about each of our own orthopedic challenges earlier on. I was working with an orthopedics network up in Maine, where we were applying agility to both their IT, but more interestingly, to their whole business operations, to how they were thinking about merging clinics, introducing new services at the clinics, moving to an electronic medical record system, changing where x-rays are being analyzed. And midway through a plan that they had for how to look at the next 90 days, let's say, COVID hit. Now, do you continue to execute to that plan, or do you stop, rethink, and double down on whatever makes sense at the moment and work really hard to figure out how do you do orthopedics, over Zoom?
That's really hard.
Exactly what they had to do. But, it's reality bites you. We are living in an environment that is volatile, that is uncertain. We just need to learn how to surf. Agile is about learning how to surf or snowboard or ski, whatever nature throws at us, and just minimize the impact of those changes that will happen. Minimize the bureaucracy, minimize the amount of long-term planning that is not easily changed. It doesn't mean we don't do long-term planning. It doesn't mean we don't have a certain level of annual operating plan. It doesn't mean that when you go and talk to one of the companies that you buy, that you invest in, you don't have a certain altitude directional plan for the year, but that plan could change. The model that I kind of like to use for that is what we call evidence-based management. Generally, there's a strategic goal. There's what we're trying to do here over the next couple of years. What's the business strategy, product strategy? that might change itself, that might move around based on what's going on, that might move around significantly if, AI is going to come and kill, if the meteor is going to kill all the dinosaurs. All of these things might change dramatically our strategic goal. But in the short term, what we do is we set intermediate goals. And, this would probably look familiar to people that are practicing OKRs, BHAGs, big rocks, whatever your flavor, that's not anything new. The important piece is that even when you set these sort of goals, what you need is to iterate towards these goals. Identify, what do we really know? What do we need to experiment on? And
so that's interesting, because you hit something interesting, which I'm finding is a problem, right? So OKR has become another, religious thing that people love to hang their hat on. And part of the problem I find is that you end up, the OKR drives your strategy because that's what people feel like they're being reviewed on. Even OKRs themselves need to follow this little map you're showing of, having very specific OKRs in a 12-month period may commit your team to doing something you just don't need to do from a strategy standpoint. But if I'm the employee, I'm like, look, this is how I'm going to be judged. So I'm going to keep going down these OKRs. I don't know if you've run into that, but that becomes non-agile.
For me, that's an OKR theater. That's not how OKRs should be used.
Right,
OKRs should be used to set a direction.
Yes.
Not to set the steps. It's like, this is the mission that is important for us to achieve. Now go figure out what's the best way to achieve that mission. What are the intermediate goals to work towards in that mission? And even within those intermediate goals, what is that going to look like?
Yep. And I think that's
and a lot of people abuse OKRs,
of course, yep,
similarly to how they abuse Agile. There's this whole dynamic that is happening in the market, which I'm spending a lot of time on in the last couple of years.
We summarize that by this statement. I sit in an engineering meeting and they show me a chart that says velocity's up, but we haven't actually shipped any software. It's like, you're missing the point.
Exactly.
Missing the point. Right?
Yes. You could call it the peak of Mount Stupid, right? We have tons of confidence in,
that's a great line.
in OKRs, whatever. Parker Gale gave us measure what matters. I don't know if you do that with your companies, but I know a lot of other PE firms and VC firms, when they make an investment, they show the founder, the team, measure what matters, the OKR book. They ask them to read it and implement OKR, so there would be some interface for managing the organization, or some the CIO, VP engineering, the product leader, they understand, okay, we have to be agile because that's the thing that you do. That created the situation where the mainstream is doing agile these days. It's not the early adopters anymore. And while there are great techniques for doing agile, there are great techniques to achieve agile at scale. The problem is that the amount of advice, the competence, if we want to go back to the Dunning-Kruger effect, that is available to all of these people hasn't caught up. The same is happening with OKRs. The same is happening with anything that's succeeding beyond, the organic ability to scale it. And that creates something that the late Jerry Weinberg called the law of the raspberry jam. There's not enough competence to spread around. So there's a lot of dogma. There's a lot of religion around how to do things, a lot of too high confidence in the skiing world. They call it the Jerrys, right? The people that go on the slopes one day a year and they think they know what they're doing, and it creates a lot of issues in our industry that actually create problems, and are part of the reason that a lot of people, when you go to a lot of product people these days, they don't want to do agile. They want to be more agile, but they don't want to use Scrum. They don't want to use, scaling frameworks, because they've seen some of the pain that results from people not doing it well. And the same is happening with OKRs. People, are already saying that OKRs are passé, because, and that's not because OKRs cannot work. It's not because OKRs are not a good idea. It's because OKRs have been abused to just replace project management with OKRs, and that's not the intent. The intent is to do OKRs with empiricism, with empowerment.
Yes. So I will tell you that our focus is on so I can only speak for what we know, right? And we buy founder-owned businesses, software businesses, and in just about every single case, it's the founder is retiring. So this is not it's not some kid who invented technology in his garage and is 30 years old, run this thing. I mean, most of our founders started their businesses in their 40s, came from the industry that they provide a solution for, and they're selling to somebody like us, and they're in their 60s, right? And there's a little bit of survivorship bias in that if they make it far enough that somebody like us will buy them, they've already been successful. By virtue of plenty of businesses have gone under, they've made money. And it's two things. So this is a big hot button for me, Yuval, because you hear a lot about private equity's value creation plan, which I think is just a crock of crapola, right? Like, we're so smart that we can jump into somebody's business that they've been in for 20 years and know more than they do. We don't, right? I would say the two things that happen in founder-owned businesses where a process like Agile starts to unlock stuff in cooperation with their PE partner is this. Founders, when they get successful, they start to get a little nervous about taking risk. These guys started, or these gals started taking risk when they started their business 20 years ago, but now it's generating cash flow. Maybe they bought a boat. We always say this is a statistically significant portion of our founders who have bought a boat, right? They don't go in it every day anymore, and they start to become, as my partner says, a chief worry officer, right? That's one part of the problem when we come in. The second part of the problem is that, and for people who only listen to the audio podcast, you're not going to see my great hand gestures, but the founders don't mean to do this, but they teach their managers to go, everything goes up through the founder, right? So in our fictional business, the founder's named Fred. Every manager knows they have to talk to Fred before they get a decision. They don't talk to Sue, who's their peer, necessarily. They talk to Fred, and Fred will tell them what to do. When the founder goes away, that becomes one of the biggest problems, is that the top level managers, they're used to going to Fred to getting a decision, and now the decision comes to them. There is no Fred, right? And that becomes they don't have these processes built in. They don't have a methodology to make decisions necessarily because they never had to, right? And that becomes one of our biggest issues.
Yeah, I see a very similar pattern in scale-ups.
Yes.
Where the organization reaches the point where there are a lot more people, but it's still very reliant on the founders, whether those are, the whiz kids, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50, whatever. There's this sort of early culture of all of the decisions going through leadership. And there's a lack of an operating system that balances effectively. How do we empower people while keeping them aligned? And
Yes.
People are working this pendulum of they're trying. I see those organizations trying to empower people. You listen, for example, to look at a very big example, Brian Chesky at Airbnb. He's been told by his people and experts, empower people, let people run with stuff. And, we became very frustrated with that eventually because there was a lack of alignment and lack of focus in the organization. The organization is all over the place. That's something we see as well. It's very tempting to go all the way to the other extreme of let's hold everything back. Yes. What we are trying to do is build some sort of operating system that actually creates that scale through the right leading with context, providing alignment, creating teams that don't need to go through leadership as much, both because we push decision rights to the teams, but also, and that's an interesting and hard change for a lot of organizations, because we start to create some cross-functional, cross-cutting teams within engineering, across engineering and marketing, or cross-marketing, sales, customer success, depending on what is it that we're trying to achieve. The power of that is that those people in those teams can now run be players, run stuff rather than just feel like pawns that wait for their leaders to have a conversation in the team. I know you guys talk about 5 dysfunctions of a teams with your companies, and 5 dysfunctions is a great tool for a leadership team to work together in the organization. But if you still need to go to that leadership team in order to have collaborations between people in their functions, then it's still not as tuned as it could be. What agility does, what we're trying to do is go beyond that to create those teams in the organization that work on some of the organization's toughest problems, whether they're in product development or more and more these days beyond, that use the same language, that become highly effective teams that know how to work effectively together, that care about, you know, results across the board rather than their own function, and are measured and are accountable for an OKR together, for a goal and a KPI together. This doesn't need to be done for everything in the organization, and that's a slippery slope as well. Some people are saying everything needs to be this way. I don't think so. I think there's still room for working, you know, in a simple way inside a function. I don't think that, you know, sales teams need to use Agile for their day-to-day, for example. Maybe not. But the way I see it, this operating system is an operating system that's great for developing your company, for changing things in your company, for working on your company rather than beyond running your ongoing day-to-day.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've seen. So, you know, my partner, Paul Stanzik, is in love with Patrick Lencioni. So, you know, he quotes him nonstop. I have to deprogram him from that. But we definitely see that. You know, one of the things that we've seen is, it'd be interesting to see if you've seen it, you know, this approach. Sometimes when we build these cross-functional teams, what we do is we make it too official and organized, and then a lot of the ceremonies become a waste of time, right? So, you know, we've got some thing we've got to do, you know, some release we've got to make, or some giant trade show, or some, you know, huge customer implementation. So you put together a team, and then, hey, we're going to get together every week, and we're going to spend, you know, an hour going through whatever. And I drive people crazy by saying, look, guys, we don't need a weekly meeting. We get a small team together, a cross-functional team. At the end of that meeting, it's like, when do we need to get together again? Right? Because it's like, we're going to get together next Monday. For what? Are we going to get anything done by next Monday? Are we going to have the feedback loop? I mean, and the ceremony starts to become, we're cross-functional because we have this meeting every week, and we're not getting anything done in the meeting because we're not giving people enough time to make progress. And it becomes the ceremony of being at the meeting and presenting at the meeting, not actually getting work done. And that is a real frustrating thing for my teams, because I have hey, we're going to get together today. And then at the end of it, all right, what do we think? Is 2 weeks right for this? Like, you're doing this, I'm doing that, you know, and they get nervous about what we don't have something scheduled, you know, you don't need it.
And that's typically when I see that, and you can imagine that I see these concerns that people have in the trenches as well as leadership. There's so much waste in the way we work. I see that often, way too often, when people aren't strategic, when people have so many things that they're working on, that the people that need to do the work, 50% or worse of their time, they're in meetings about the work rather than doing the work. And for me, you know, there's a good conversation around whether you need that work session or not. I'd rather it be a work session rather than a status meeting.
Yes.
But if all we can do is spend an hour a week on this thing that is strategic to us, that to me is the smell. Is like, what are we doing here? Is this really one of our strategic goals? We can't have 30, right? That's another OKR theater problem. If we have 30 goals, none of them is strategic.
It's like my old boss once said, who was phenomenally successful, but he loved malapropisms. And one of his favorites was focus on everything. It's like, guys, we can't focus on everything. By definition, you can't focus on everything, right? And we do see that, right? There's too many strategic, but again, strategic is also overused as a word, right? That there's too much strategy. which sounds good on paper, but it doesn't work. And we've just seen it doesn't work. There's this people get lost in the details of it. They also get lost in the details of, I don't know if you see this as well. One I've seen, for me, LinkedIn's a place to see what goofy trends are popping up, because you see, so for example, you cannot go a day on LinkedIn without getting a Chat GPT cheat sheet. It's just, like we need another one of these things, right? But one of the things I see you'll see pop up from time to time, and we're in another cycle of that, is the Jeff Bezos meeting philosophy of what made it successful is, you read the thing before you go to the meeting, and it's one pizza, whatever. It's like, hey, great, Jeff, I'm glad that worked for you. That doesn't mean it works for every other organization. That, I look at this as building an agile way to work, maybe somewhat custom for each organization based on the skills, characters, and the type of business. So picking somebody else's thing that worked for them, that's great from a research standpoint. And like, hey, let's see what somebody else did. Does that have any application for me? But it may not work in my organization, right? I don't know if you run into that yourself in real life.
All the time. I mean, Agile should be around first principles. It should be around, why are we doing these things? It should be around empiricism. It should be around balancing alignment and autonomy. It should be around continuous learning and adjusting even the ways we're working, rather than sticking to dogma. That's what Agile should be about. And that's hard, right? Working from principles, it's hard. It requires critical thinking. It requires you to think about what you're doing. People want those shortcuts. And, if we go back to what's going on in this industry, we're now in the late majority for this agility. And these people don't have the patience for thinking about how to do stuff. They want the playbooks. And even though in the playbooks you include what are the principles, it's hard to get them to pay attention to that. That's part of the culprits, I think, or I'm seeing behind this Agile theater, Scrum theater, OKR theater, just copy pasting something, not understanding what's behind it. So
and I think
a huge problem in our industry.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to, I mean, you mentioned empirical evidence, and that's another one of, a lot of times fuzzy numbers, strict conclusions on fuzzy numbers is stupidity, in my opinion, right? That, I think you need to use, common sense around empirical evidence in some cases to decide, is this working for us? Or is this not the whole process, this thing? Hey, are we moving as quickly and as effectively as we could be here? Sometimes that's a little bit of a subjective measurement, right? You can have some empirical evidence, but it's a law of small numbers potentially. And so trying to say, oh, we're at 52%, therefore we're better. It's like, let's dial it back here. Is that really where we want to be getting to, right? And that becomes, I see that in two ways. We see the organizations that become overly focused on the ceremony, the Agile theater, and the other half who are so offended by the process that they say none of it will work for us. Like, I'm going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I can't do anything because there's one little piece of it just doesn't work for us, right? And that neither one of those are good things, and I see a lot of that. We see a ton of that, neither of which I think is effective for how we work.
Yeah, I'm gonna maybe talk about an example of a similar case that illustrates this scenario. I worked with a biotech firm here in the Boston area a couple of years ago that essentially tried to use Agile, tried to use Scrum, and they were trying to do it in a very interesting environment, both for engineering, product development, R&D, as well as they were trying to think about how to apply it to other stuff like running tests in the lab, trying to find, capsids that are beneficial. That's what their business was around. But going into the situation, Scrum was perceived very mechanical, micromanagement without real value. And, this the Scrum Masters that they had were considered meeting organizers, task trackers. That's a very common, situation when I meet organizations.
We describe it as that breathy, young, excited young person that's got like an armful of file folders, and they bustle into a meeting, that's taking notes, and asking people that they become the, did you get this done this week? Did you get what are you going to do next week?
It's horrible, right?
It's
that's
horrible, right?
not the intent.
Right,
And
exactly.
what we did there was teach them the principles, teach them the critical thinking behind this, help them to shed away some of the mechanics. There's a lot less agile mechanics in that organization right now, but there's much more agility. There's much more agility in how they manage the work, how they plan the work, how their leadership team is working, because we applied some of these ideas there. And there's much more agility together with much more alignment in how they run their planning and strategic planning process. They were using OKRs before I came, but now they're using OKRs in a significantly different way. There's much more of that balance of alignment and autonomy, and how do we involve people in planning? How do we connect without prescribing the connection? And I can tell you that once we established the principles, what principles were important, how it was important to organize teams that can really run with stuff, I don't have a lot of work to do for that organization. That's the beauty of it.
Mm-hmm.
They get it. The leaders in the organization get it. They become masters of agility and how to drive towards agility. It's a long journey to make that happen, but now it's their journey and not something that somebody came down from Mount Sinai and dropped a full methodology on their laps.
Yeah, I think the other part of that we see, which I don't know if you see this as well. I'll make 2 points. One is, you mentioned this earlier. There's so many bad agile consultants out there that you can easily get down the wrong path if you get the wrong people that are sort of dogmatic. I would say the other side of it is that we tell people, there's this feeling, as I'm doing another visual example that nobody can see, that, as you're doing Agile, you're getting, more and more effective. It's a line that goes up and to the right consistently. And that's not the case. To me, Agile is like anything else. You're going to have some flat steps where you just get a little tired. It's like people who start out and maintain an exercise program, they may just go gung-ho, for a while. I always say, don't go crazy gung-ho. Don't go from doing nothing to saying you're going to work out 8 hours a day, because you won't. Go from nothing to 15 or 20 minutes a day, right? And then you'll plateau a little bit and then you get reinvigorated again. So the key for us is don't go backwards, but it's okay, sometimes if you need to put it in neutral, right? Take a breath, because sometimes time helps, give you some perspective on, hey, is this working for us? What's not working for us, right? It's let's use Agile to affect our Agile process, not just use Agile to affect our products. And that becomes a hard thing, I think, for people to do, right? Because they feel like if they lose that momentum, it's never going to get back again. When in reality is, you just can't work at a unbelievable clip nonstop. You just can't do it.
There's an interesting corollary between what you're describing and some of the debates, let's call it, in the Agile religion wars of the early 2010s. Okay, there was this debate between Scrum, which was considered very revolutionary, burn your boats, you're in the new world, call things very different names, just capture new ground and, you should succeed. And there was this Kanban approach that was more evolutionary, that was more, let's meet the organization where it is, let's evolve, let's, not just map how things are working, but also start to go on a diet which limits the amount of things that you're working on, limits the amount of big rocks, the amount of small rocks that the team is working on, limit the amount of stuff that an organization is working on if you're at the portfolio level. And that might take more time to make an impact, but in many cases, it's more sustainable, as you're describing. It's a diet that people both understand better. They understand why are they making a certain change. They see the connection, the correlation between, oh, we're working on so many things. This is what we do in order to reduce the amount of things that we're working on. We are asking people to talk way too much across organizational boundaries. Maybe it makes sense to actually create some teams that will cut across. It's a more organic introduction of patterns that work. It requires more patience. And patience is hard to find in many organizations, especially as they're trying to transform. But it is a better fit in some cases.
Yeah.
So if you look at the Agile ecosystem, there are techniques that are based more, and people that are that have a preference for this evolutionary, more agile, if you want to call it that, method. That also, by the way, involves the players, involves people in the organization in building their own story of what Agile looks like, which is my preference. I mean, when I go into an organization, a big part of it is, giving people the tools to build their own operating system.
Right.
And it's never the same. There are, repeating patterns, but people build their own Lego, build their own operating system out of it. And I find that more sustainable. I find that for at least the organizations that I'm working with, and maybe there's some, correlation match there. Maybe the organizations that pull me in are organizations that are looking for these sort of pragmatic, principle-oriented solutions. And I'm totally happy that those are the people that I work with. I find that these people, even if they pause along the way, they make some of their decisions using, these new principles. And at some point, they'll get back to the table and think about, okay, what's the next peak we want to pursue from the perspective of improving autonomy? How do we create some more cross-functional collaboration across functions? What's the next strategic thing that we want to tackle as an organization? What's the next important thing for us? What would be the right way to tackle it if we follow these principles?
Yeah, so we run into a couple of problems, in that, and I think, I do think in general in the market, Agile is well known enough that now people are trying to look for non-dogmatic solutions, right? In the early going, they grabbed any consultant they could find, and you got a lot of bad ones because they just, they went to a class, they got a little bit of the religion, and the success was to just apply the religion to your business. Because if it didn't work, then you could say you're doing the religion wrong, right? So it take the blame off the consultant. It's like, well, you're not doing it perfectly, so that's why it's not working for you. Which is, I think, it's a crock, right? So we see a couple of challenges. I don't know if you see this yourself. So one, because we are focused on founder-owned software businesses, that in the early going, from a development standpoint, almost always the founder had some customer that was more like a consulting customer. They kind of built the product for a customer or two, and then over time, every net new customer, they would, grab, oh, they had a great idea. They'll only buy it if we do this, and we'll add that in, right? So it becomes, now, again, survivorship bias. Plenty of those businesses are gone. The ones that we would buy, or any of our competitors would buy, have gotten to some, they're 20 million of revenue and 3 million of EBITDA. So they've done something right. They've successful, but they still have that DNA, right? Of they go to see a prospect, and the prospect says, I'd buy it, but I don't really love this. And then, we come back. Now, we had a great guy in our portfolio. This is the funniest thing ever, because his name is Mike Profit, which both Profit, FIT, and PHET. He was a product manager. He had both those. But Mike would always, he had a great approach, right? His approach was product roadmaps should never be super defined. They're directional as opposed to commitments. And his argument was, hey, see all these wonderful things that we're talking about doing, Mr. Prospect. And the prospect would say, yeah, we love all those things. And his argument, and if you ask me to do this one custom thing for you that you claim is the only reason you need this thing or you can't buy the product, I can't do all those other wonderful things. Because if I say that to you, I got to say it to the guy down the street and the guy down the street. And suddenly I'm spending most of my time doing custom. And most of the time, when presented that way, they would say, something, you're right. And if you can get to that approach, a Kanban style works great, because we're picking from a basket of stuff to get done, as opposed to we've committed to this, rigorous product roadmap that prospects have committed to, I mean, it is, by the way, just my wife says, the corollary here is my wife says she married me from the demo, but the production release has been a very big disappointment. There were features shown in the demo that made it to production. She's not wrong, right? So I don't know if you see that, in not just software business, but businesses in general. Have you seen that, those two problems that
Definitely. I'm working right now with, I see it more often than not, but just one example is an IT organization in a pharma company that I'm working with right now, that they have that project mindset. They're just doing what stakeholders are asking from them. They want to move to a product mindset of, we have some sort of direction of where do we want to take this, rather than do everything that we're being asked of. But whether it's a founder-led company that started with custom and it still has client concentration, which is worrying from one perspective, but also conducive to the sort of product management struggle or lack of real product management, as you might call it. And whether they actually solve the client concentration, but the culture still stayed that sort of product roadmap is used by the salespeople to go and sell stuff, and salespeople sell, ask customers, what do we need in order to sell, or, are willing to have these conversations with customers. And the people in the organization, in the product organization, don't have the conviction and don't have the support by leadership to actually say, no, we have product strategy. We listen to our customers. We listen, we build a picture, we do pattern matching. We look at what the market needs, and we will figure out a roadmap that does not necessarily map one-to-one to what the stakeholders are asking for. This is what we call real product leadership. This is what we call real product ownership. It's very rare out in the trenches. It's much more common to have people that use agile processes just to manage a feature factory. So definitely a challenge that, regardless of the agile process that you use and the agile framework that you use, all of them are trying to point you in the direction of real product management. But the problem is not necessarily in the agile framework that you use. It's with, does your organization have what it takes, the understanding, the willingness to change its culture to be a product-led culture, or rather than a project or stakeholder-led culture, which is hard, not trivial.
It's hard, and we see it. I often use a very simple, stupid metaphor called the BMW and the bulldozer, right? If you need to move a bunch of dirt or snow, the bulldozer is your right choice. If you want to go fast on a highway, the BMW is your great choice. That usually gets me into an argument with people who like Lamborghinis versus Mercedes, but just for the purposes of alliteration, I use two Bs, right? The challenge is that you get in a sales process, and you do run into these situations where they're looking at us and they're looking at a competitor. We're a BMW and they're a bulldozer. One of us are in the wrong spot, guys. Like you got two guys in this process, and we don't make any sense, right? If you're buying a bulldozer, you're probably talking to John Deere and Caterpillar. You're not talking to John Deere and sales. Again, this is not inside sales. You see a big customer with a big budget, you just want to make it, well, we could put a blade on the front of the BMW, and that's technically possible, right? And you could, right? But it's not to walk away, the discipline to walk away and say, guys, we're not the right fit for you, right? Long term is a much better solution than trying to start to stretch into a category that you weren't trying to stretch into on your own ahead of that prospect. You may have decided, hey, this is where the market is going, we're going to move in that direction. No, we've got a prospect who's got us in the wrong spot. And that's really hard to do, right? Because the sales reps looking at some, especially if they're like, hey, this is a $2 million deal, I can get this year, this is amazing, and to tell that person, look, we can't compete because it's going to make a mistake for them. But that's really hard. And a lot of organizations, when faced with that, they just can't make the tough choice. And that's, despite the fact that they've got a product mindset and they're trying to stay focused, sometimes that dangly carrot looks so interesting that
There would be exceptions. The question is, what are the exceptions and what's the ongoing thing?
right.
And by the way, if all of our salespeople are hitting a need for a bulldozer and what we have is a BMW, that might be a reason that we need to pivot, to go
Yes.
back to the drawing whiteboard and say, okay, what are we doing here? Product should be connected and in tune to what sales are hearing. So, what sales are seeing, what the business is seeing out there in the trenches should definitely affect what we have on our roadmap and where do we go. But it should not be we do this thing just for a specific client. It needs to be something strategic.
Yep. Now we see that as a closed loop. So here's where we like the Agile approach across functions is, if we're getting drawn into a bunch of situations that you said where, wow, they look like they need a bulldozer and we're a BMW. Sometimes it's like, hey, the market's moved and we've got to move with it. Sometimes it's the marketing function is attracting the wrong prospects. Yes, we're getting pulled into a bunch of bulldozer things because whatever it is we're saying from a marketing standpoint is convincing bulldozer shoppers that we're a fit, right? And that's the mistake that hurts us the most in the market, in my opinion, because it's like we're making a directional change that we don't need to make. It's because we're talking to the wrong folks, right? And that's hard. That's where, and again, this is not an insult to marketing. It's not a knock on marketing. Product management be telling marketing stuff that's causing them to go in a particular direction, but it's this closed
so you're
loop.
pointing to what we talked about earlier, which is there's a set of things that happen in the life of a company at certain points, which are very hard to fit into a function.
Yes.
It's not marketing, it's not product, it's not sales, it's not customer success, it's not engineering. It's something that needs to cut across. And the typical way organizations are structured and operate, all of these situations go up all the way to the leadership team, because that's where these functions sit. And, we can make it work better by working on the effectiveness and the performance of that leadership team, whether we use this model or another, but that's not scalable. If the larger and larger the organization, the more such situations we'll have, the more people will feel like pawns where the real players are making the decisions we just execute, the less likely they're gonna come up with creative solutions to problems. If we want to tap into the potential of the people we have in the trenches, these ideas of feedback loops that involve all these people, what we refer to as rugby in the world of Agile, we want to have this rugby game happen for these sort of challenges as well. The challenge of a mismatch between the BMW and the bulldozer that has marketing aspects, pricing aspects, sales, customer success, the product itself, or whatever. We want to bring all of the players to play rugby together, not just have a meeting once a week to discuss it, but put them in the room, give them an Apollo 13, situation where, Houston, we have a problem. If you remember that scene where all of the relevant engineers were locked in a room, feed them pizza under the door, give them everything that they need in order to simulate, the problem and try to come up with a solution, and they just work it out.
Well, the best part about that is the Ed Harris line. Let's not make the problem worse by guessing. This is a great Ed Harris line at the top of it. He was perfect. This is Eugene Krantz. So here's what I'll tell you is the only, in my opinion, as an operating partner at a private equity firm, here's our value, right? So you have this value creation plan, which is all, in my opinion, just crapola. Here's my value in terms of this conversation with our portfolio companies. We own them, okay? So I can say the stupidest thing I want and you can't fire me. And that's my job. My job is to go into product and engineering sessions is like, look, I understand there's hierarchies in these companies. I understand trust can be a problem, and an employee doesn't want to look foolish or take on a project that, may hurt their, reputation, right? I can do all of those things. And that's what we should be doing as private equity partners. Is my job is to suggest stupid, I'm not saying I'm picking stupid things. I can, hey, what if we do this? And then it's amazing. When I say something like that, they all gang up on me like a wild pack of, Wolverines, which is perfect. I don't care. But and you know what? We end up with a good solution because they know the answer, and they know more about their business than I ever will. And that's where I see, agile processes. Like, you got to have somebody that can be the suggester of craziness, or I can't be hurt. So there's nothing to do. There's nothing to do in that organization that's going to hurt my reputation. I don't care how stupid I look. I don't care what I ask. And usually we end up with a better solution. But the problem I see is a lot of outside people, private equity people, consultants, they don't want to look stupid, right? They need to be the strokey beard, here's where you're wrong kind of thing. And I think that's useless in most organizations, personally.
So I guess the interesting question is how can you scale the value that brings? How do you create an operating system where you can unleash the ability of people inside to experiment with potentially stupid ideas, throw something at the wall, see if it works or not, which is exactly what we're talking about here, right? Come up with ideas and try them as quickly as possible, because there's no big risk, right?
So I tell you, from a totally scalable standpoint, I haven't solved that problem. Here's the only reason it works for us. We're a small private equity firm. Yeah, at most I've got 10, maybe 12 companies in our portfolio. And if we're doing things right, that my team isn't heavily involved in those companies after a couple of years, because they're running at their own pace. They're cranking it out, right? So they don't need me. If we go sell a company, most of the time, the people who've been hired in the last couple of years don't even know who I am. They may have
so there's something that you're doing probably in those early on interventions that is unlocking something.
Yes, but it's always
creating a culture in which people feel like they can bring up leap of faith assumptions, loafers, and have conversations around them, or something in the organization learns how to try things and avoid that risk and worry that you talked about earlier.
But I would say it's still, in our case, it's a semi-formal process. It's an informal process, right? It's not. I couldn't take this out as a framework that people can use, right? I mean, I'll give you a funny story. We owned a company many, many years ago called Royal and Company, and of course they had a lot of great. They had a big campus. They had a lot of conference rooms, and they named one of the conference rooms in engineering. They had other kind of pithy patterns. A lot of times conference rooms have Star Trek names, or whatever. They named one of the conference rooms after me, and they only used it for stupid ideas and conflict. It was like, this is one we got to take to the Millbury, and they would go into the Millbury conference room, and they meant it as a compliment, and I took it as a compliment, right? And then it was, it became this kind of free space. We're like, all right, we just don't know what we're going to do, so let's go yell at each other and draw stupid ideas on the grease board. We'll come up with something, right? Which is pretty funny. So I don't, I would say I haven't cracked that diamond to know how we can make it truly scalable. I've got a relatively small team. We've got a relatively small number of portfolio companies, and we've got a focused fund. We only buy software companies. So the only thing that makes it work for us is I've got a little bit of a smallish world where I can jump between it. If it's certainly not a process. This is certainly not something I could turn into a world-class solution. So have we solved the world's problems here today? Yuval, I feel like we have.
All of them.
Okay, so if they want to get in touch with you, how do they get in touch with you to bring your magic to their environment, to their non-agile environment?
To their non-agile or to their agile theater. I spend a lot of my time these days fixing agility. I'll tell you that. Fixing agility and writing about fixing agility and my thoughts around that. If people want to find me, I write about that in my blog. at yuvalyeret.com/blog, which surprisingly enough is my site. There aren't that many Yuval Yerets in the world, so if you type Yuval Yeret into Google, you'll probably find everything about me. If you look for me on LinkedIn, there's only one, as far as I know, out there in the world, and that's me. I'm happy to connect and talk about anything related to bringing pragmatic, principled thinking to the world of agility, whether it is inside product and more increasingly those weird outside product business agility scenarios that we talked about.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for being a guest today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.